Okay, welcome back to the 25-year Seeds Church Story podcast. And today we're going to enter into part 6, which is the most recent phase, beginning roughly around 2020 and going to today. And just to revisit, like, why are we doing this podcast again, Darlene? I don't think we've talked about that in a few parts, but just now that we're a bit further into it, what are we trying to do here?
I think we're trying to do two things. One is to get out of our heads and hearts some of the stories over the last 25 years as we approach the 25th birthday of Seeds, and to help us maybe process and reflect and release as we transition out of leadership at Seeds.
Yeah.
So it's to pass stories on, to spur on other people's stories and our own stories, and to have a way of acknowledging the journey, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you put that well. So today we want to pick up with maybe a little bit of untold stuff that from the last episode that we ran out of time to get into everything. There's lots of central themes and events and periods that as we start to remember the last 25 years. And so let's start off with something that actually happened around, I think, 2015. So it's going back a little bit, but it had a significant impact on the last 10 years and continues to have a lot of influence on how we think about our direction at Seeds Church. So I want to take us back to a leadership retreat that we had. I believe it was at the very beginning of 2015. We had a tradition at Seeds of taking the leaders away on a retreat for a couple of days every January, a way of either, doing some learning together, focusing on what some of the bigger critical issues were for the congregation, what we were looking forward to for the new year. And in this particular one, I remember it being one of the ones where we thought, like, well, we're going to do some learning together. And so one of the ways we often did learning together was we watched Leadership Summit talks that came out of the Willow Creek Leadership Summit. And back in those days, many of us would attend leadership summits. We'd go to Winnipeg and be a part of that. But sometimes we just felt like there was talks that would be really significant for all of us to engage with and do conversation. And I remember that we sort of were, it was taking kind of some of the work off of our shoulders to bring content to the retreat. And I think the first talk that we watched was a talk by Patrick Lencioni, who was a leadership consultant, wrote a lot of good books like The 4 Dysfunctions of Teams, and
I think that's 5.
5 that many 5 dysfunctions of teams and stuff in that realm. And in this particular one, it was focusing on finding organizational clarity, like were we clear about who we were, where we were going, what our values are. And I think if you would have just asked one of us prior to that, we would have said, yeah, we're pretty clear about our direction and our mission and stuff like that. So we watched this talk where he asked 6 critical questions, and we decided to just everybody write down their answer to what they think Seeds' answer to each question was. And the 6 critical questions were, the first critical question is, why do we exist? Our purpose. What do we do? How will we succeed? Strategic anchors. What matters to us? Or how do we behave? Our core values. And then what's most important right now? Who does what? So we did this exercise, and I remember asking the question, why do we exist? And across the board, everybody wrote down on their paper. So we did it kind of like a test. everybody said, we exist to make Jesus real. And we kind of like, okay, check. Clarity. And then the next question we asked was, how do we behave, or what were the values that matter to seeds? When we went around the room to look at what we wrote down, there were a lot of different answers. I mean, many of them kind of had similarities to them.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
Did we still have the seed 7 at that time?
Yes, we did have the seed 7. So we had
said seven values.
7 core values. And honestly, I can't remember what they all are right now. I mean, one was peace, one was worship, one was generosity. That's 3.
Connectedness.
Connected.
Responsive.
Was responsive one of them?
I think so.
Okay.
I think the 3 that we landed with were
open.
in the 7.
Okay, open. So that's 6. And then worship.
Did you say peace?
I said peace at the beginning. Did I say worship?
Oh, transparency was one of them.
Oh, transparency. Right. So there were 7 we had. And nobody named all 7, I remember. And maybe some people said things differently, but it was clear that we were not all on the same page with the language that we were using for our values. And then we worked through all the different questions, and we kind of realized as we looked around that we lacked quite a bit of clarity about our answers to those 6 critical questions.
And I think Patrick Lencioni's perspective was that you can't have more than 3 to...
Well, at least in values.
People can't remember. You can't focus on 7 things. He really... Obviously,
because when we asked people what we should focus on, nobody could draw on all the things that we were talking about. Yeah, so at that time, we began a process that took about, I think, a year or 18 months, where we really wanted to hone in on focusing our answers to those questions. And I believe it's significant to Seeds because it's from that point on that we've continually been revisiting and talking about as leaders these answers to these 6 critical questions, especially the first 4, which are purpose questions, the value question.
What do we do?
What do we do? Which I don't think we ever really thought about that question. Maybe the answer that we came up that I think has been significant is what we do at Seeds is we create environments for people to connect to God, self, and others. And so it was a lot simpler for us to ask the question, okay, what are our environments where we do that? Are there other environments that we could be creating that would help us to do that? Are there environments that maybe we should stop doing because they're not helping us do that anymore? And I think too, that question, what's most important right now, is a question that we have often asked Since then, every year or multiple times, we would ask the question, what's most important right now? And I know for us, the clarity about those things was very much internalized in us. Like we didn't have to have a card that showed us what that was and we had to refer to it. Those are things that we could just talk about. If somebody, put a gun to our head and said, what are the answers to the 6 critical questions? We would be able to formulate that very simply. And then we worked hard at fostering and stewarding that in our congregation. So our leaders had that internalized, and hopefully even our congregation would have it internalized, because these were things that were very mobile too. They could go with us, and we could see how they were, showing up in other people's lives. I'm just thinking about just last week when we mourned and celebrated Wes Sawatsky, who's been with us since the very beginning. At his funeral, it was so obvious as people who weren't connected to Seeds were talking about Wes's life, language that flowed out of our DNA at Seeds was coming out in how Wes was described. And so when we think about our core values of being open and connected and responsive, those words kept coming up to describe how Wes lived his life. And it was kind of a neat thing to see that he was somebody who was a part of our congregation who lived that out in a way that impacted others.
Yeah, so that's when we started using the language of a playbook or a playground. That's when we really came up with like the answers to those questions, to those 6 critical questions we formed the structure around which we lived and moved. And I think too that the portability of the DNA, it got more like, okay, this is what we've uniquely been called to at Seeds. It's not that there aren't other things that are important.
Right.
But this kind of became the structure and the playground for which we invited people in the community to play. And I think Wes's example is a beautiful one because it wasn't just a church environment. It's a life orientation. It's a life playground.
Right.
So a child can take it into their classroom and nurture and play with being open and connected and responsive. And, Wes could do that in unique ways with all kinds of people that he encountered in his life. So, yeah, it's a beautiful way of kind of seeing how a community that nurtures faith in a particular way has impact, influence, consequences, like positive consequences in life, in all the other environments that people are playing in, whether that's at work or in a sports context or in a friendship context, whatever. So anyway, yeah, those 6 critical questions, I think really helped shape the community in the last 10 years.
One other thought I had about it was, if you remember when we were talking about earlier phases of Seeds, we had a long conversation about how we tried a bunch of different things and experimentation, and you kind of asked the question, like, what do you think was going on there? Was it just because we didn't know who we were, or what was happening there? And I feel like in this phase of our life at Seeds, we were kind of, we were in the late adolescent years as an organization, as an organism. It was like we started to understand our identity in a way that we couldn't really understand at the very beginnings. Like, we had all kinds of dreams and visions and hopes and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know how clear we were about, okay, who are we going to be? What is going to be our core identity as a congregation? And it felt like in this phase, we were starting to understand, okay, who are we? We could try to be other things or look at other congregations and say, hey, it would be neat to be like that or whatever, which is kind of a thing that happens as human beings as we're growing up.
We try different things on.
We try things on, and we're not quite clear about who we are, and we're influenced from things on the outside. And then I feel like Seeds kind of came into its own during this phase, and we started to understand, okay, these are the things that are important to us. And not everybody has to be like this, but this is who we are, and we want to be true to who we are.
And it has to be big enough, like broad enough to encompass like a big enough tent, but also not too vague, It has to be specific as well. Yeah.
And I think too, I don't know if we've talked about this in the context of this history, but continuing to understand how Seeds has been a center set church where we've tried to focus on kind of a central operating, motivating core, and giving people the freedom to work with sort of that animating energy as a congregation, and not focusing as much on putting a boundary around who we are as a congregation, saying like, are you in or are you out? No membership, trying to be as open and inclusive as possible, but being really clear about the center that we're focused on, that we're not just focusing on any center, we're focusing on these 6, core questions that we've answered, and these values and our purpose. And that's how we have become who we are. And thinking about how things will go forward, I believe that core identity is so important to the congregation going forward, because they may define how they live that out differently than we've done it in the past. But I believe the core is going to kind of stay, unless, I don't know. I mean, how could the core change? I mean, the core could change, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. It's not going to be our job or task to be a part of that, but
Gotta let that go.
Well, so I think it would be good to now move into probably the largest thing that we would think about when we think about the phase that starts in 2020. And that is, the global, I don't know, what do you call this? The global thing that happened early in 2020. It's called the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And quite honestly, I don't think we can mention that without everybody who was around in 2020 would go somewhere.
I heard, actually, I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and I heard it was an interview with Malcolm Gladwell talking about his book, The Tipping Point, and his what's the title again?
The Tipping Point Revisited.
The Tipping Point Revisited. There we go. The people that were interviewing him referenced the pandemic, and the thing that kind of was interesting to me was they were talking about, oh yeah, I remember like at the end of February or the beginning of March, people started to say, there's this thing going on in China. Something's happening in the world. And then at some point, and I think this person said it was March 13th, that it was kind of like this, something is happening, something is brewing, we're hearing about something. And then on a particular day, somewhere between March 13th and March 15th, everything changed for the entire world. We went home and we were scared. Mm-hmm. And, we didn't know what was happening, but it was like, for us, I remember because it was your birthday week and we had plans of people coming over and like,
And on March 18th, we were supposed to get on a plane and fly to London.
Exactly. And it just...
That was all up in the air already by March 13th.
And it all shut down. Yeah. And our lives and our community's life and our world's life changed.
Yeah.
It just almost gives me shivers, actually, when I think about that.
Yeah.
Throughout the time, I know there was a lot of people that were asking really big questions about what's going to happen to the church. What do you think is going to come out of this?
Like they were asking that right away?
No, not right away, but throughout, like sometimes when we were in the middle of it, because I recall feeling like I can't engage that question right now. We're in something. I can't talk about what's going to be the outcome of it. We're still in it.
Right.
So we just have to navigate what we're in right now.
Yeah. I remember personally that because we were gearing up to take a mini sabbatical, I can't remember how much time we were going to be gone, but I think we were going to be gone for about 4 weeks. And I remember us feeling and talking about how we just were in such a need of a break. This was going to be a part of your master's education. It was a study tour, but we were just so looking forward to the break. And suddenly the break was off, which had felt so hard for us personally. And then the next thing we realized was we were now faced with a humongous challenge as a church and as leaders and as human beings, and just wondered, like, did we have capacity to really engage the amount of change that was about to happen? Like, coming back to those critical questions, the question, what's most important right now, was dealing with and managing a global shutdown. Mm-hmm. I mean, that economic challenges and emotional challenges.
Yeah, I was going to say that has and continues to have huge ramifications, I think, of what all happened as a result of the pandemic. We can talk about, how, I think the church is not the same post-pandemic. Politics are not the same.
Yeah.
Family relationships are not the same.
Yeah. Communities are not the same.
Yeah.
The society is different.
Yeah.
And I think most people would agree that we haven't really reckoned with or come to grips with those changes. Like, we're still looking back to that. How often people look back to that 2020 pandemic beginning when they talk about just about anything. Like, it's like we can't even talk about the history of seeds without thinking about how that even changed how we remember things. Mm-hmm. Like, it's messed with our timelines.
Yeah. So when you think about that, like, we have this playground and these values of being open and connected and responsive, and we put that into a time frame during the pandemic where we had to rethink connection, and openness, mm-hmm. where we were our beliefs were tested and our patience for difference was tested, mm-hmm. where we made decisions that really had very big consequences and we all had to live with the decisions that we had to make. There was so much decision fatigue. Mm-hmm. You used the word capacity before. I think the word capacity became like, suddenly we were all talking about people's capacities and how people's capacities are diminished.
Yeah.
And it's like we're all at home for a large chunk of time and really not doing, quote, anything, but doing a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that looked so different for different people, depending on, if they were in emergency kind of, what's the word?
Like healthcare?
Healthcare but other, like, what's that called?
Like
grocery.
Like frontline people.
Frontline.
We started talking about frontline workers, grocery stores.
Yeah.
Hospitals. Everything. Garbage collectors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This fundamentally shifted how we think, I think.
Yeah.
So that, it was a huge challenge for us during COVID. I can think about creative ways that we tried to connect. And
so it's obvious that we can think of kind of the negative impacts of that 2 to 3 year period that we were like living in lockdowns and lockdowns off, lockdowns back on. What were some of the things that we found ourselves doing to be creative in dealing with the situation we found ourselves in? Like, we talk often about being open, connected, and responsive, like you just mentioned. how did we stay connected when most of the time we weren't actually able to connect with people outside of our home?
Maybe because we're just about to enter into the Advent season. I'm thinking about Advent at home packages that we created, or a team of people created. Basically take home experiences to do with your families during Advent and Christmas.
Yeah, that was Christmas 2020. And so there was like an Advent calendar that people were able to build and have daily interactions as a family.
Some of it involved, so we took, again, our playground of being connected to God, self, and others. And there was activities or prompts in there. Sometimes it was about for yourself, connection to yourself, like here's a tea bag, or sit down and light a candle and ask a question or whatever. There was stuff in there that related to sharing love with neighbors and dropping things off, or so that was kind of one creative thing we tried to do. Of course, we connected over Zoom. We recorded music in our own homes and had some musical projects where we sent music to people. We had a Christmas Eve service all online that one year.
This podcast, we started podcasting as a way of
connecting to people,
connecting as leaders to our community. And when we were able to start meeting, at least with a very small group of people, we started to stream services. One of the things I find interesting is we started doing things that we didn't really imagine doing when we were kind of in normal times, and the abnormal times pushed us to try some things. And it's interesting that streaming of church services has become common across churches in North America. Before the pandemic, some larger churches were doing it already and putting energy into that, but it also became sort of like a necessity for churches to do that. And you see that's just a normal part of church life today. That one of the weird parts of it is we know people connect to our service on a regular basis, and we don't necessarily know who those people are. We wonder if they're still connected based on not seeing them on a Sunday morning, but maybe they're still connected through technology that we started to use.
We also at some point started to meet outside. I'm trying to remember.
We did. I remember we did some forest church opportunities where we would build a fire outside, and because we were allowed to gather in larger groups outside, we did things like that. It was also interesting how the pandemic forced people to simplify their lives in ways that was experienced as a positive thing.
Well, simplify their connections too, which again, there was upside and downside to this, but you had to choose if you're going to be allowed to see 4 people or 6 people, which are those 6 people?
Yeah.
Who's going to be in your bubble? We talked about that became language that we talked about. And in some ways, I think that led to losing connections with maybe some wider connections with people. Because you kind of had to pick who your priorities were. And maybe I know that I've reflected with other people in the church community too, feeling like certain friendships fell away And sometimes, again, I hear people reflecting on it in positive ways and in ways that really hit a need. And you would hear people say, I don't want to go back to the way things were after the pandemic, because we've been sort of, the whole world has been forced into a new reality. And some of that is positive, some of that is good. For many people, church attendance just never came back after the pandemic either. Mm-hmm. Not that we had a strong community of like every Sunday we go to church. It was already changing before that, but the pandemic definitely shifted people's sense of where it was important to gather and what was okay to let go of. And there's probably a lot more underneath all of those things in terms of big faith questions and deconstruction and places where people want to prioritize their time and energy and have capacity. So very overall, just an incredibly difficult time period. And I think we're still trying to find our way. Yeah. But another thing that came out of that time was more concentrated conversations about seeds and the building and what would eventually become known as the community exchange. Yeah. The conversation for a community organization or a vision for connecting with a larger community and using our space at the exchange, that was starting to happen before the COVID. And then the pandemic allowed some opportunities for conversations on Zoom with a lot of community partners that eventually led to the birth of TCE. And that's like a huge thing that happened in 2020 to 2024.
Yeah. It's interesting that in so many ways, our lives during the pandemic and also church life shrunk down to kind of bare essentials. Mm-hmm. Like we just did the least amount that we could do. And I think one of the things that we kind of wrestled with was everybody was challenged in their work life, in school life, in family life. Like everything was being challenged with trying to, adapt to new realities all the time. I can't remember how many times we had to adapt to new rules or new things that we were learning, and we had to kind of make a decision. And it felt like we were weekly doing this.
Oh, so many decisions. Oh, that just kind of puts this pit in my stomach. And also talking with other people that were navigating huge decisions in their areas. So I think about all the teachers in our area, and we have administrative people that were trying to make big decisions, and we had healthcare people and
and business leaders, employees trying to figure out what to do, what made sense to do. I mean, I think that's where we started talking about decision fatigue. I don't know if I'd ever talked about that before, but just tired of making decisions.
Even though people weren't doing as much, like people, let's say, were just in their homes, their schedules had simplified, but there was more exhaustion from the other kinds of challenges, right? That fatigue that you're talking about. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, it's okay. But one thing that I found kind of encouraging about Seeds as a church community throughout that time was that we still were asking the question, what's most important right now?
Yeah.
And two of the things that were answered by that question, like one you just mentioned, the community exchange, ideas. And, we continued to move forward, believing that something needed to happen for a community organization to be birthed. And so we were able to have conversations with many community stakeholders in different organizations to get TCE off the ground. And that didn't stop because things were shut down and slowing down. We felt like we still needed to move on that. The other area that we moved on was what we talked about in the last podcast, which is the rainbow community inclusion conversation. And it was during COVID that we began to process that as leadership. And then eventually we had a church get together where we talked about it and made the decision to become an affirming church. So I find it, I find it encouraging that we still were wanting to ask, well, what's the most important thing to do right now? And it didn't all involve the pandemic. Mm-hmm. It felt like there were things that we needed to move on despite the pandemic. And it's so interesting how we just loathed getting together on Zoom, meeting on Zoom. People were tired of that. People were doing school on Zoom and all that kind of stuff. But here we are able to use technology to keep connected with people and say, how are we going to move forward on these important issues or these important projects that we still want to do? And so it feels like there was some resilience shown during that time. It wasn't just all negative. It was like there was possibility to move despite our circumstances. And I just feel like that big stuff happened during that time.
For some reason, I'm just thinking right now about right before the pandemic hit, Wanda had painted in the auditorium at the Exchange that painting of all the hands.
Oh yeah.
Right. Was like an image of connection and intimacy and stuff. And then it was like, that was a prophetic painting or something, because then for the next 2 years, it was like, don't touch.
Yeah.
I
hope all those hands had a lot of hand sanitizer on them. Oh yeah. What a crazy time. I really wonder if we talk about this 10 years from now, what will our perspective be on that time? It just feels like it's still such a huge, it's one of those things where we say like before the pandemic, after the pandemic, like we just can't, view ourselves without relating to the reality of that. And I don't know. Do you have anything to kind of reflect on in terms of, like, we sometimes feel like polarization in our society, in our community, got amplified during COVID, and we haven't really recovered from that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we're maybe not feeling as intensely about some of the things that we felt maybe collectively during that time, but it had consequences, it had impact, and there's all these slogans of in this together and we're all together, and attempts to stay together, to stay connected. And that was a real challenge amidst very different ways of understanding and thinking about that. And people had difficult situations to manage in families and for sure, in the church. And we made, I think, decisions with the best knowledge that we had available to us, and not just knowledge, but wanting to take time to listen and to move with purpose. We used our playground to make these decisions. And I think some people didn't understand them and some people really did. But we erred on the side of protecting the vulnerable. And I think that came out of wanting to stay true to what matters to us in other areas before this. That there may be lots of things and people to pay attention to, but we will err on the side of the most vulnerable. And so that's why we made a lot of the decisions we did. And I can't say we did it all perfectly. No. I don't believe that. But I do, I still have a sense of feeling proud of us as a community in navigating that time.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a situation where they're saying things like we did the best we could with the information we had at the time. Now, many years later, we have some different information and things aren't nearly as intense. We still have COVID as a reality in our world, and people are getting COVID, and, hospitals and, healthcare places, they're still dealing with managing it. But everything just seems like it's more like a part of life than it was then. And what that does is it sometimes makes us do revisionist history, and we look back and thinking like, oh, why did we take that so seriously? Or why were we so afraid? Or why were we so, why did we make those decisions? We probably didn't have to make those decisions, but they don't take into account the reality that we were dealing with at the time. And, I just know, like, some countries, our neighbors to the south, a lot more people, a percentage of the population died because of COVID than happened in our country. And I think some of that has to do with decisions that people made at the time. And I don't think we should, we can't sort of go back and say, we just totally should have done it differently. It's more like what can we learn from it? And maybe we'll make some slightly different decisions going forward. And who knows if we'll have to deal with this again in our lifetime. I sure hope we don't, but.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the present day at Seeds. And I think in our next podcast, maybe it'll be the last podcast, we will talk a little bit about learnings and failings and the growth that we experienced over the years. And although our time as leaders is coming to an end, we maybe want to throw forward a little bit what we might see, what we think is, not that we know much about what's going to happen in the future, but maybe we have some things we might want to share to bring this 25 years to a close. So thanks for being with us, and we'll see you soon.